Hey everybody, thanks for joining me on this special episode. I'm joined with a bit of a unlikely collab partner here today. I got Dr. Kill, aka Kipp Davis, with me, and so a lot of you guys know his stuff from his own channel, which I definitely recommend checking that out. It's just Dr. Kipp Davis. Give it a search. He's been on Myth Vision many times, and a lot of other channels, and so. Thanks so much for joining me, Dr. Kipp.
Thanks, Eric. It's fun to be here. This is my first ever foray into enemy territory.
Well, that's good, man. I think it's good to foray into enemy territory every now and then. And so I'm sure people are going to expect us to fight and all this other stuff to the death. But really, what I wanted to talk to you about, and what we had talked about before, is there was a video about 3 months ago on Dr. Sean McDowell's channel featuring Dr. Craig Evans, who's a well-known Christian scholar at Houston Baptist University. And he said that some of these Dead Sea Scrolls, which apparently you yourself have worked on, he didn't refer to you by name, said that, no, actually, they're not.
Design.
Yeah, it seemed a little bit like it. But anyways, he said that some of these scrolls that you said are forgeries, and others, of course, you're not alone in your assessment here, are actually genuine. And he decided to announce it on Sean McDowell's channel. And so I watched the video, and then I saw you in the comments, and then I saw your video response, which was excellent. And I just thought, you know what, like, it would be really good for you to be able to tell your side of the story to a Christian audience, because I think we ought to strive to be fair. We ought to strive to be balanced. And I just thought it was a really fascinating topic. And clearly you are an expert in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like, this is your main bread and butter. I mean, I know you do other things, but like, this is something that I found your video to be like extremely well done. And you obviously know your stuff here. So yeah, maybe give us a little bit about your background as a scholar, and then kind of set up what happened here. And then we'll just go through the video together and go from there.
Yeah, sure. So I am I'm a scholar of Old Testament and early Judaism, specifically early Judaism, and my specialization is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there most acutely it's epigraphy and paleography and Scrabble practices. And so like this is definitely something that is right in my wheelhouse, and more I guess even more on point, the Dead Sea Scrolls forgeries were the texts that I have basically been working on since like 2012. I was part of the team that that basically discovered the forgeries and did the major publications on them. And just so you know too, I have when this all went down, I was asked by the Museum of the Bible to write up an extensive report about their collection specifically, which consists of it's either 14 or 16 fragments. I'm gonna get that. Yeah, it's either 14 or 16 fragments. And so because we had published the volume. So let me just actually get this. So we had published the volume, the Dead Sea Scrolls Fragments in the Museum Collection, and it was during the analysis phase and the editorial phase of the volume where I and some other people who weren't involved with the Museum of the Bible stuff, but other private collections were having serious misgivings about the authenticity of the fragments. And so it was sort of this, there was sort of this awkward time period where the volume was published, um, I had my suspicions about the authenticity of the fragments, but it came out anyways. And as a result of that and then subsequent research, the volume itself has actually been retracted by the publisher. Braille has discontinued it because the fragments have all been demonstrated to be fakes. So I I had spent, after the publication of the volume, I spent another 3 years basically just working through um, a developing myself and then implementing a thorough system and method of Scrabble analysis of the fragments in an effort to you know really clearly demonstrate the problems and the issues with it. So I ended up compiling a 220-page document that I delivered to the Museum of the Bible in mid 2020. I'm now in the process of hopefully actually publishing this. I actually just heard back from Oxford University Press this last week about the manuscript, and I will be developing part of it certainly for a more like a more general audience. And the other part I'll probably save for a technical paper in a journal or something. But yeah, so that's me. That's kind of the work that I've done on this stuff to date, and we can totally talk about uh, how a lot of this went down.
Yeah, for sure. And so when we're talking about the Dead Sea Scroll forgeries, what exactly are we talking about here? We're talking about some. We're not talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Obviously, like that's well established, right? What's been discovered, and so we're talking about some manuscript forgeries, fragments that have kind of popped up, and they kind of have taken this like status where they're almost. I feel like personally, and maybe you agree, it feels like people are searching for them like they're searching for like bits of the cross or like they almost have like this what's the word that I'm looking for here,
They're relics.
relics. Yeah, the relics is the one that I'm looking for. And so
Yep.
yeah, so tell us a little bit like how these have started to surface, and why you and others are researching these things.
Yeah. So, yeah, this is super important because I think when people hear about Dead Sea Scrolls forgeries, the conclusions that many leap to is that all the Dead Sea Scrolls are forgeries, and that's not the case at all. So I'll just give you a little bit of background. The Dead Sea Scrolls were part of a series of discoveries between 1947 and 1953. uh, Hundreds, thousands of fragments of manuscripts that were found in 11 caves within about a 1.5 kilometer radius of this ruin called Chibet Qumran, just which is on the western shore of the Dead Sea, kind of on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea there. Um, and these are all authentic, genuine manuscripts dating back to at the earliest the late 3rd century BCE. Most of them, however, belong to about the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE or AD. They are copies of so-called biblical texts. So these are our oldest copies of texts of what we understand to be scriptures. But that comprises only about 25 to 30% of the whole collection. The rest of the manuscripts are all sorts of different things, from copies of early Jewish texts that we already knew about, like First Enoch, or the Book of Jubilees, or the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. And very excitingly, with respect to something like First Enoch, the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve our only actual Aramaic texts of the Book of Enoch, which has been translated into like Coptic and Greek and Slavonic. Sorry, I've got dogs as
You got the
usual.
pooch.
um, so but then there's all sorts of other stuff there that nobody had ever seen before. A huge number of the texts were ones that scholars have identified as sectarian, and these are texts that pertain to, they reflect a common theology and ideology which we identify with the Essenes, known from the writings of Philo and Josephus, and scholars by and large tend to attach the text to this group of people, and then this group of people to the the site itself, to Qumran. Um, so there's lots of those, but then there's other texts as well. There's, an Aramaic text called the Genesis Apocryphon, or there's other texts which have been designated things like the Apocryphon of Joseph, or the Apocryphon of Jeremiah, just on the basis of the fact that they seem to feature major figures or events from biblical history, but don't look anything like the Bible. And then there's, texts that contain calendars, and there's texts that contain rules, and there's texts that contain hymns and songs and rituals, which seem to have had an active life within the community. So this is the Dead Sea Scrolls proper. These were all texts that were discovered, like I said, between 1947 and 1953. And then after that, there was a period of, 20, 30, 40 years where there was no activity, there was no new texts. Scholars were waiting pretty much through the 60s, 70s, and the 80s for the publication of the material, which was taking a very, very long time. And scholars were getting quite frustrated at the pace of publication. So there's this period of 20, 30 years in which almost nothing happened. And then in the early 1990s, the editorial board for the publication of the scrolls overturned. Professor Manuel Tov from the Hebrew University took over and expanded the editorial team, and things started to filter out into publication with some greater speed. So at around this time, this is the 1990s, a private collector by the name of Martin Skyen, who lives just outside of Oslo in Norway, was looking for Dead Sea Scrolls fragments that he could actually, buy and own, but was, frustrated to discover that it seemed like there was nothing out there that wasn't already in a museum, or in, most of them were at the IAA, the Israel Antiquities Authority. There were some at the University of Manchester and at the National Library in France. There's a handful. I said Manchester already, didn't I? Yeah. So Manchester, France. There's a couple of these. There's a small collection in Amman, Jordan as well. So he's frustrated that he can't have one for himself. But then ended up getting into contact with a couple with the families of two of the original scholars who worked on them, John C. Trevor and William Brownlee. And it turns out that they actually had these tiny little fragments that were gifted to them way back in the 1940s by one of the original owners, Mar Athanasius Samuel, who was the metropolitan at the St. Mark's Monastery in Jerusalem. So he had just given them these tiny little bits as a token of appreciation for work that they had done for him. And so Skyen approached the families of these guys and said, "Hey, would you be interested in selling these, these little fragments that you have to me?" So he bought them in 19, I think this was 1990, 93, 1993, 94. And so he was by this point, as far as we knew, the only owner of, Dead Sea Scrolls fragments other than a museum or like an institution. It turns out there were a handful of others who had bought fragments in the 1960s, in the 1950s and 60s from, the antiquities dealer who we call Kando, who basically handled all the transactions of the fragments between the Ta'amida Bedouin who found them and the archaeologists who ended up publishing them. He was also selling just a handful kind of on the side to people who would come into his shop from time to time. So Martin Scoyen actually managed to track down some of these people and then bought 4 more fragments, all of which I think are probably genuine. But then after that, Kando Sr., this antiquities dealer, he passed away. His sons took over the business, and all of a sudden, the market just kind of exploded. Starting in 2002, there was suddenly, dozens of these fragments on the market. And between 2002 and 2014, I've counted 80 fragments that have been sold to a variety of other of private collections, and then evangelical institutions like Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, Azusa Pacific University, and famously Museum of the Bible. So these what I and others have identified as the forgeries are these fragments that were sold between 2002 and 2014, which look remarkably different from all of the original material on a number of fronts. And there's several features that they have which clearly indicate that they are really, really different and problematic. And we can talk about that as we take a look at this interview with Craig Evans. So, but
Yeah.
that's kind of a background snapshot of what's going on here.
No, it's a good background, like you said, and it's just like, I don't know, it's like Raiders of the Lost Arky almost to like on a very smaller scale, but it's just kind of fascinating. It's almost like I could see a movie being made with some of this stuff, but I don't know. But yeah, I think that's a good segue to what we're gonna bring up here with the response to Dr. Evans, and so I'll go ahead and play some of the video. Now, I want people to understand, like, this isn't an attack against Dr. Evans, or certainly not Dr. McDowell. The whole point here is just, I wanted to, like I said, give Kipp here an opportunity to respond to a Christian audience, because a lot of people that are watching my channel, let's just be honest, they're Christians, right? A lot of people who are watching your channel, Dr. Kipp, let's just be honest, they're probably skeptics. But I think it's important for people to see that, like, I don't know, for me, when I watched all of this unfold, I'm just like, what is the big deal? Like, why? Like, this seems so, like, kind of unimportant. Why are we turning this into an apologetic issue? Why are we turning this into a Bible issue? It's just like, it feels almost like a bit of a distraction. But ultimately, I just want people to be interested in the truth and to get both sides of the story. So yeah, we'll go ahead and bring on the video here, and just tell me to pause it at any point. And I know you got some slides, so just let me know when you need me to toggle there, sure. And we'll go from here.
Is also a fake. Well, it turns out our guest today, Dr. Craig Evans, who is a distinguished professor of Christian origins at Houston Christian University, says there's a bigger story that many people need to pay attention to. Craig, honored to have you on. When you and I first started talking about this at a number of weeks ago at a conference, you started sharing stuff, and I thought, how have I missed this? You got to come on my show and share this with my viewers. And in this show, you actually are going to break some news that I think is going to stir things up. So can't wait to get there. Thanks so much for coming on.
You're very welcome.
Well, you did mention the Dead Sea Scrolls, so let's jump ahead to that one. That's perhaps one of the biggest controversies of our day. And what you said to me is that there's some evidence that these fragments that were purchased by the Green family, of course, in the Museum of the Bible, universities like Azusa Pacific, Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, might not be fake. Where's the data on this right now?
Oh, it's rather impressive. And what it's done, it's opened up a whole new item of inquiry. And so, Sean, your program will be the first to hear this. So
Okay.
I'll not only I'll get you and your hearers updated
Mm.
on these fragments aren't fake after all, but are genuine. But it raises a whole new question about Jewish understanding of purity and why the leather scrolls were used in the first place, leather instead of presumably cheaper papyrus. So we're into
maybe
something
just
that
pause it
it's
there
going to
for
be
a
quite
sec.
astonishing. It's going
Yep.
to
Go ahead.
I think it's worthwhile kind of going into some of the background just of this interview. So yeah, I think maybe even I go back to in the first week of January, I think it was, Sean McDowell did an interview with this guy, Jeremiah J. Johnston, about this new book that he's written on the 7 best evidences for the resurrection or something like that. The book is called Body of Proof. So he did this interview and I made a response video with Apologia to this video. And I had attempted to make contact with Dr. Johnston even before this response video came out, just to talk about some of the issues that I had with it, with the interview. In the process of this, I learned that Jeremiah Johnston was a former student of Craig A. Evans, which is kind of interesting because I also am a former student of Craig A. Evans. He was still at Trinity Western University in the 1990s, where I did my Master of Arts degree, and he was actually the second reader. Oh, look, it's Paul. Hey, Paul. He was also the second reader of my MA thesis. And then, I graduated, and he left shortly thereafter and went to Acadia Divinity College in Wolfsburg, Nova Scotia, which is where Jeremiah Johnston studied, and then after that he ended up at Houston Baptist University. So anyways, Paula G and I made this response video. It came out, and the day that this video came out, I got a notice in my email inbox from Craig Evans, and it scared the Sorry, it scared the crap out of me.
Yeah, there you go. You got to Christianize the cuss words there.
There's Eric ready to hit the mute button. So it really alarmed me, because my first thought was, oh no, he's upset that I've said mean things about his former student. So I mean, it took me like a couple hours just to work up to opening the email, and like this was just a coincidence of timing, I'm sure. I think, but in this email, Dr. Evans tells me, like, he and I don't talk a lot. Like, it's the first time I've heard from him in probably 3 years. So like it was a surprise. But he tells me that basically he's returning from this meeting in Denver at the Society of Biblical Literature, which was in late November, and was part of what's called the Dead Sea Scrolls Foundation, which is it's a private organization which was originally founded to raise money for the publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They don't do so much of that anymore, and I'm still a little fuzzy in terms of what the function of the organization continues to be now that all the Dead Sea Scrolls are published. But that's an aside. He's part of this organization. He says they had this meeting, and at the meeting, and he'll talk about this, came to the conclusion that all these fragments that I and my colleagues had published between 2016 and 2019 as forgeries were in fact genuine. So, and then in the email, he mentions to me, he says, so, I just did this interview with Sean McDowell. It's coming out tomorrow. Be sure that you watch. Let's stay in touch, kind of thing. So this was my introduction to this. So I sat down and watched this video, and unfortunately this was like a pre-recorded thing, right? This wasn't a live interview, so there was no interaction between the audience and with Craig Evans or even Sean McDowell. Yeah, this is how I ended up coming to watch this interview. So, but yeah, we can continue.
No, yeah, that's funny. The timing of all of that.
I know, right?
With Apologia video, like, but yeah, let's. I'll bring Sean and Craig here back on.
Generate a lot of conversation, and to the best of my knowledge, you were the first to hear this, and the first to air it. So let me back up. These fragments. Here's what created all this suspicion. A wealthy collector in Norway gave an interview 20 years ago, and he said, "Oh man, I'd give a lot of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, even millions of dollars, to have fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls." And he actually named certain books, curiously, mostly from the Pentateuch, and plus the old Aramaic text. We'd found, I think, at least 20 fragmentary scrolls of Enoch in Aramaic. And so he mentioned Numbers and Deuteronomy and Enoch. And curiously, within a couple of years, on the market were fragments of the very books he mentioned. And of course, what a lot of people assumed was, poor recent doctoral students in Hebrew who hadn't found a job yet and had $100,000 of tuition.
So pause it here, because he's got the timing wrong on this. So there's a couple things. The interview that he's talking about is one that appeared. This is Martin Scoyen, and Martin Scoyen gave an interview with Herschel Shanks of the Biblical Archaeology Review in 2002, basically in which Herschel Shanks said, if you have Dead Sea Scrolls fragments and are interested in selling them, you should get in touch with Martin Scoyen. So that happened. Something else that also happened was that behind the scenes, and this was not public knowledge at the time, Martin Scoyen was talking to William Kando, who is thought to be the source of all these fragments. He is the son of the antiquities dealer Kando, who handled all the original materials from the 40s and the 50s. So Martin Scoyen behind the scenes was consulting Kando and basically giving him like a shopping list, saying it would be great if you could find fragments of Nehemiah and First Samuel and First Enoch, because I'd be very interested in buying this stuff. And lo and behold, everything that he wanted to purchase specifically, Kando managed to find and to sell to him. What Evans is getting wrong here is that this was not public knowledge until I think it was 2017 or 18 when this was finally revealed, and it was part of an article or a series of articles that my colleagues had written. So right at the outset, Craig gets a lot of the story and the timing just totally wrong here.
Okay, no, that's fair enough. We'll go ahead and continue there and see what else they got.
Debt loan to pay off, got busy with some authentic fragments of very old leather and wrote out brand new script, just a few words and lines, on fragments that in some cases were hardly bigger than a postage stamp, and started selling them to this collector in Norway and into the very schools you've mentioned, as well as the Museum of the Bible, the Green family, and everyone else. And so people were immediately suspicious. Isn't that strange? This guy gives an interview, mentions certain scrolls that he'd love to buy, pay a lot of money to get them. And lo and behold, a couple years later, a bunch of these fragments start showing up on the market. Now, I have to admit, I was suspicious too. So a former student of mine, who will go nameless, I did his MA with me when I was in British Columbia, Canada. And then he went on to do a PhD. He's a very fine student. Well, he had a research grant that took him to Norway, and he was privileged to see this collection. And he did something that apparently no one had done before. He started looking at these fragments very carefully under a microscope. And he got some other experts involved. And they said, boy, this really looks suspicious. And so without going into a lot of the scientific detail, what he noticed was the leather under the microscope was obviously old. It's 2,000 years old. But this is what was mysterious. Leather, as you probably know, if it gets really old, it dries out and it cracks. And if under a microscope, just imagine my fingers, the gaps between my fingers are the cracks. Well, he noticed that the ink would jump the cracks, the ink, that set the letters. So the leather was clearly old when the letters were added. And then he also noticed that there'd be, under the microscope, you could see it, imperfections, scrapes, abrasions, maybe bits of dirt, soil embedded into the letter, and the ink would go right over it. So it's like, wait a minute. And so the suspicion was, and this is the conclusion everybody jumped to, was the leather is authentic. It's 2,000 years old. But these fragments were blank. And only in recent years, say 20 years ago, after this interview was given, people started writing, and it's the Hebrew Bible, so it's no mystery as to what the text is. It'd be really easy to do it. So you take a little fragment, you place it right on the Hebrew Bible in a certain location, and now you know which letters and words to write over the fragment. Looks like an authentic piece of Deuteronomy or Numbers or whatever. So that was the theory. And so this was actually published in Dead Sea Discoveries. That's a respectable journal, Revue de Qumran. And so, oh my gosh, and I mean, people got fired. There's been lawsuits initiated. Wow. We want money back. I mean, it's getting to be quite a deal. And again, for legal reasons, I'm not going to name names. I'm not going to get into it.
Sure.
I have cautioned a few people. You might be suing somebody for selling you an authentic fragment. So be careful.
Oh my goodness.
You could end up getting countersued. I mean, there's things. Check it out. Now, here's what happened, Sean. I've been appointed to the Dead Sea Scrolls Foundation.
Let's stop there for a second.
Yeah.
I think he does a decent job of describing, I would say, one of the main problems with these fragments. Mm-hmm. They are clearly very old, weathered leather. Most of the Dead Sea Scrolls are written on parchment, which is animal skin that's been finally quite specifically prepared for writing. Now, all the or I should say the ones that have been not all the Dead Sea Scrolls forgeries, the post 2002 fragments, have been assessed using the physically assessed or scientifically analyzed. I worked with an organization called the Bundesanstalt for Forschung und Prüfung, otherwise known as the BAM. This is in Berlin, and they developed a series of tests for assessing the material in an effort to determine what it was. The conclusion, it's not definitive, but what looks to be the case is that all these little fragments, they're ancient leather, certainly. There's major questions as to whether or not this is actually prepared parchment. And as a result, the surfaces are very, very poor. They're not forgiving. They're extremely hard. They look extremely weathered and damaged. And the impression when you see them from a trained eye is that it looks like the leather was already badly dried out prior to when scripts were like words were actually written upon them. This was a strong indicator to us that these were ancient, already badly weathered pieces of leather, which were written on much, much, much later in time.
Right.
Importantly, though, this was not the first thing that we saw. This was not the first feature that we noticed, which keyed us into the thought that these fragments might be forgeries. And something else that Craig said in this interview that I found completely bewildering is he suggested that it was my innovation, or our innovation, the team that I was working on in Norway in 2012. He seems to suggest that it was our innovation to actually sit down and look at fragments of Dead Sea Scrolls under a microscope. This is nonsense. I mean, certainly this is something we were doing, but this is something that people have been doing for decades now. I mean, as soon as they could, scholars at the Israel Antiquities Authority were looking at fragments of Dead Sea Scrolls under microscopes. It's part of the study of the material. There are people at the IAA now who don't do anything but sit in front of microscopes all day long looking at this stuff. So this was not our innovation. This was just part of doing business. This is the way that we read this material.
Sure.
And
I mean,
yes,
it makes sense that you would look at
right.
under a microscope. I mean, just common sense is like, let's closely inspect this as much as we can. So,
Of course. Maybe now is a good time to share my screen and
yep.
to just show you a little bit about what I'm talking about here. So I'll show you a few things. One of the things that my colleagues and I keyed in on these forged fragments, which strongly suggested to us that they're probably forgeries, had to do with the alignment of the text. So I've got this is a small fragment here from Scoyne's collection, and I believe this is text from Samuel. Um, but you'll notice I've drawn some red lines here to show that the first visible line is straight across the fragment, and then the second line on the bottom actually is out of alignment with the first line, which is unusual when it comes to looking at the literally thousands of fragments of authentic Dead Sea Scrolls fragments. They're all the stuff lines up pretty well. But the other thing here that looks really suspicious to me is the fact that the letters on the bottom of the fragment actually look like they're following the contour of damage. So, like somebody's trying to squeeze them onto the bottom of the fragments so they're visible. But this is something that we saw throughout all sorts of fragments. You can see it on this one here, which is a fragment from a psalm, again in Scoyne's collection. I think this is the one where it's perhaps most obvious. This is a fragment from the Museum of the Bible. I think this was the Jonah fragment. So you'll notice this line at the very top of the fragment is angled downwards, and again looks like the letters are trying, whoever's writing this, it looks like he's straining to get this stuff onto the surface, and it's following the contour of damage there at the top, and you can see how far out of alignment it is with the most clear line of text here on line 3. So there's other major problems, but this was one of the significant ones at first. I'm going to skip this bit about paleographic anomalies, just because it's pretty technical. But I'll move on to talk a little bit about scribal inconsistencies. So something else that we tended to see was it looked like certain letters in Hebrew were very strangely formed, and maybe not in the right place. And also because it looked like somebody was applying these to an already damaged fragment. So here on line 2, and you'll forgive me, I forget what fragment this is. I think this is from the Museum of the Bible. But hey, can you see my cursor? You probably can't.
No, I can't.
Okay.
Do you need me to move something somewhere?
I don't know. So if you look, you've got a line of text at the top of the fragment. You can see that, right?
Yeah.
Then you've got a second line, and remember, this is Hebrew, so you're reading from right to left. And even if you can't read Hebrew, these are the sorts of things that I think somebody would be able to notice. In this second line of text, you'll notice it comes up, and then there's a break. There's kind of like a big hole. And then that same line of text continues, just kind of there's like 2 little letters sitting on the bottom of the fragment. And the letters look really small. And they also look really high on the line, as if, whoever was writing this was trying to squeeze them on to the fragment. And this is the sort of thing we saw all over the place. On this one, on the bottom line of this fragment, there's like a big section where the line is broken. And on the far right-hand side, you've got a couple of tiny little letters that are squeezed onto the bottom corner there. And again, they're very small. and they're badly out of alignment with what follows on the other side of the fragment, which is supposedly, this is supposed to be part of the same line. And yeah, again here, there's a number of these instances where letters appear on the fragment that are considerably out of character from what I would expect to see if this was an authentic fragment. So these are the kinds of features that we were seeing, which indicated to us pretty strongly that, yeah, these are probably forgeries. Other things going on here too. So some of the problems have to do with the actual text itself and with some of the textual variants. So this fragment here is a fragment from the book of Deuteronomy belonging to Azusa Pacific University. So the one on the top is the one that belongs to Azusa Pacific. The
Mhm.
one on the bottom is an authentic fragment from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, what's really remarkable about these two fragments is that the text is an identical match. It's the exact same text that has somehow miraculously been preserved on these two completely distinct fragments.
Yeah.
But they line up too, line for line. They match up perfectly well. And one of the things that's just a kind of an on the nose dead giveaway is there is a Scrabble error on this authentic Dead Sea Scrolls fragment, where the scribe has confused two letters. He's basically transposed them in the word shalom. The word is shamaltacha, and he's written it shalamtacha, which is an obvious Scrabble mistake. It doesn't really make good sense in the text, and scholars look at that and say they recognize that, oh, this is one of these understandable errors that scribes will make where they accidentally transpose letters. Maybe this scribe was dyslexic, but the crazy thing is that this same Scrabble error, which is kind of a nonsensical thing, was even preserved on this fragment belonging to Azusa Pacific University. So, I mean, my impression right away when I first saw it was, well, it's obvious what's happening here. You can even see, if you've got a great imagination, you can even see how the shape of these two fragments is kind of similar. I figured what's going on here is somebody is using this fragment, this authentic fragment from the Dead Sea Scrolls, as a template for making his forged text.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So that's one. This one here is a fragment from the book of Jeremiah, and this is in the Skoyan collection. It preserves a pretty striking textual variant in the bottom line there. I've actually highlighted the letters in red. The Masoretic text reads Eich, and there's the Septuagint reading of the variant is actually three words instead of Eich, which in Hebrew just means how. It's genoito kuri hoti. Yahweh was, and then it starts like a new sentence with that or then. And it's the sort of Scrabble error that or the sort of Scrabble difference that editors looked at and said, well, how on earth did this come about? How did this happen? And it was thought that maybe this reading in the Masoretic text, the one word Eich, Aleph, Yod, Kof, was actually like an acronym standing for three letters, Amen, Adonai, Ki. Well, lo and behold, we have this fragment from Skoyan's collection, which preserves basically a Hebrew text of the Septuagint translation, the Greek translation, and lo and behold, it also matches perfectly with this suggestion
Mhm.
by the editors, even though they had no manuscript evidence for this. So it's kind of like, I've called this sort of a smoking gun kind of bit of textual or scribal evidence. It's one of the sorts of things where you come to understand is almost too good to be true. It just matches an editorial suggestion so perfectly. It's
Mhm.
almost hard to imagine that this is, an actual thing. But
Yeah.
this is probably my favorite one, though, and there's a bit of a story behind this one. So this is a fragment from the book of Nehemiah in the Museum of the Bible collection. And I was working on this fragment at the time while I was still living in Norway and working at the University of Agder. And the text here, it's highlighted in red. The actual text is supposed to read Va'ashuv va'avo, which means and he turned and he went. I can see Va'ashuv there very clearly. It's the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 letters there. But
Mhm.
then what is supposed to be Va'avo is not very clear, and it's obviously damaged, right? And when I first saw this fragment, and when I first saw the additions that the editors were working on, I was really struggling with how they were reading it, just because there were some major problems with how the ink and the text were lining up. So that's kind of where this started. But at the time, I was working on I don't know, I was working on like another paper or something for a conference, and I needed to look at a Hebrew Bible text, but I didn't have my copy of Biblia Hebraica Stucartensia with me at the office this particular day. So I went up to one of my colleagues and asked if I could borrow his. And he had like a really old um, publication of the Hebrew Bible from like 1937 um, that he let me. He's a New Testament scholar, right? So, and he's
Mhm.
an old guy. It made sense to me that he didn't have the most recently updated version. So I borrowed it and I brought it down to my office, and I was just kind of thumbing through it looking for the text, and I happened to land on this passage from Nehemiah chapter 3,
Mhm.
and it just struck me as soon as I saw it within this printed edition from 1937. I was like, holy cow, this looks exactly like what's on my fragment. So here's the word in question, va'ashuv. The first letter starting from the right is a vav, then an aleph, then a sheen, then another vav, then a bet. Then this little squiggly bit beside the bet is supposed to be another vav, and this is the letter that I was really struggling with. I'm like, I cannot figure out how that could even possibly be a vav. And then when I saw this printed edition from 1937, I saw this. and and what
Mhm.
this is the word va'ashuv, but at the very end of the word
Mhm.
is like a superscripted little Greek letter, alpha, or
Oh, geez.
yeah, it's alpha.
Yeah.
And this corresponds to a note, right?
Mhm.
An editorial note in the apparatus. And when I looked at that, and then I went back and I looked at the fragment, I'm like, of course, whoever uh, is writing this doesn't understand what he's seeing, and he's misconstruing the superscripted notation for actual text, and then
Yeah.
has accidentally written that on his fragment. So that I don't know, to me this was probably the most obvious sign of
Yeah.
a modern forgery in the whole collection. So gonna stop sharing my screen at this point.
Yeah, that's fine.
So these are the sorts of things. It wasn't just the condition of the leather. There was all sorts of stuff
Right.
that was going on with these fragments, and this is a process too. It took the better part of 2 years of carefully just looking at stuff, reviewing it, double checking things. We did these forensic analyses at the the bomb in Berlin, which revealed all sorts of other elements, which strongly suggested to us that these are actual modern forgeries. So all that to say, when Craig says we were just looking under the microscope and seeing the cracked and damaged leather, that's just one element
Right.
of a much bigger picture here, which convinced us.
Clearly you're making like a broad case with multiple lines of evidence. You're bringing in all kinds of things here. It's not just like we looked at this under the microscope and it's like, no, there's all kinds of things being brought to bear here. And so, again, I just find this whole thing strange because it's like, to me, it's like, well, why? Why are we making this into an issue? Why is this on go ahead.
No, I was going to say we can talk a little bit about that too, because I think it's important. I actually just I was at the University of Helsinki last week, and I gave a public talk in part about this issue. It's something I'll be uploading to my own YouTube channel, hopefully in the next few weeks. But yeah, it's addressing this issue of what motivates people to produce these kind of forgeries, and who's buying them and why are they buying them. I mean, there's like a whole market that was basically established for these things, and I think it's telling, and I think it should be alarming for like everybody, not just not whether you're a person of faith or not. It's troubling how much money is involved in this, and the rationale behind what people are spending and why they're spending it, and what they're hoping to achieve with these fragments. So
again, that's part of why I wanted to have you on, because I'm seeing like this is like as low stakes of a low stakes issue for Christians. Like, this is not like I'm going to hinge my faith on like some weird fragments, but it's like some guy says, "Hey, I'm interested in buying fragments." Suddenly a bunch turn up. I mean, even Evans himself said, like he was kind of suspicious. We're looking at these things. We're examining these things. There's clearly big business behind all of this. And and like you said, you're bringing in multiple lines of evidence and showing like, no, these are not. And it's just for what? For like these people to have like these personal artifacts like in their, so that they can show off. It just seems to me like a very strange thing for Christians to kind of latch onto. I don't know. Again, I look at it kind of weird.
Especially evangelical Christians.
Yeah.
Because like the way I have, and I've written about this quite a bit. And in one of the places that I wrote about the Dead Sea Scrolls forgeries, I called them relics, right? Like modern day relics. And they seem to be the kinds of relics that appeal to these evangelical institutions, like Southwestern Baptist, like Azusa Pacific, like the Museum of the Bible. There's actually a really great interview with a scholar by the name of Weston Fields, who is mentioned in this video with Craig Evans. So he gave an interview, or not an interview. He gave a talk at the Lanier Theological Library I think it's in Houston, or is it Fort Worth? I don't know. I get them all mixed up. But anyways,
it's in Texas. I know that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in Texas. So he gave this talk there about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and during the Q&A portion of the talk, somebody asked why the scrolls are significant for Christianity or for the New Testament. And he talked about the usual talking points about establishing the text of Scripture prior to anything that anything close up to the 1940s. And he talked about how much the scrolls have helped us to understand Jewish culture at the time of Christianity, and helped us to understand some of the Aramaic language in early Palestine, which has been useful for some New Testament scholars with regards to Aramaisms in the Gospels, especially, right? So, I mean, all that's totally legitimate. But then he starts going off on this weird thing where he talks about maybe the most famous of all the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is the Great Isaiah Scroll. It's a completely intact copy of the book of Isaiah. It's dated to about the 1st century BC. And he starts talking about this Great Isaiah Scroll and saying, suppose this was the scroll
Mhm.
from which Jesus read in the synagogue.
Yeah.
In like, where is that? It's like Matthew. I don't
Luke chapter
remember, but
4.
Luke chapter 4,
Yeah.
right? So you know this story. Like Jesus opens the scroll of Isaiah and he reads from it, and then he says, I'm telling you that this has been fulfilled. So Weston Fields says, could you imagine if this was the scroll from
Yeah.
which Jesus read? And then he goes a step farther. He says, the location and the time, it matches pretty good. And then he goes a step further and he says, just imagine if we could, extract fingerprints or DNA
Yeah.
from the manuscript. Like, basically, he's making. As I've talked about it in other places, I've talked about how much people seem to want to have or to make a connection with the Bible that Jesus read, which is basically what he's saying here. We've got an object that maybe Jesus touched. This makes it super special and super important to us. And I find it sort of from an evangelical perspective, I find that rather odd and unusual with
Yeah.
how much evangelicals tend to, um, you know, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? How critical evangelicalism has been historically of relics,
Mhm.
of these magic objects that make connections with. It's not about that, right? The
Yeah.
importance is the truth of the scriptures. The importance is the message, right? So it's it's wild. And and there's and this is this kind of mentality has been marshaled in different ways. That's one way. The uh, An officer from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, when they bought their collection, it included a fragment with text from Leviticus chapter 20 and Leviticus chapter 18 in that order. It's small, it's only 4 lines of text, but it's from that large section of Leviticus dealing with sexual morality, and in particular, this is where the passages against homosexuality are, right?
Sure.
In a news article, like in an interview, this guy from Southwestern said that they actually paid more money for this one fragment than for the other 7 fragments in their collection. And in his words, the reason why it costs so much is because it testifies to an eternal truth from God's word. So,
Are they
like,
finding like fragments from like these other canonical books, or is it just like Jeremiah and Leviticus? Like, because no,
yeah,
the Christians aren't going to care about something from the Book of
exactly,
Jubilees or something like that. Maybe Enoch
exactly.
slightly, but like it just makes it even more a little suspicious to me.
This is one of the things that very, very early, one of the questions that was raised that made people really suspicious. Like I said, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, like in the collection of authentic scrolls, what we would consider Bible comprises like only 25, maybe 30% of the whole thing.
Hmm.
The scrolls that were being bought by Scoian and Museum of the Bible and Azusa Pacific and Southwestern, we're talking like 90% of them were
Hmm.
biblical text. Scoian has like 3 fragments from the Book of Enoch, and he's got one authentic fragment from a manuscript called the Rework Pentateuch. But virtually everything else, it's like biblical text. So yeah, you're right. It's an obvious it's an obvious instance of people creating a market and satisfying a market demand, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and
So
I think what bothers me too, and maybe we'll continue with the video, but like Craig
yeah,
later is like very, very, very confident that what he's saying, like, no, these are definitely genuine. And I'm just thinking, like, okay, as a Christian scholar, we need to like make sure that we're making some modest claims here and that we're not like overselling stuff, because if we jump on a
yep,
bandwagon that is completely unnecessary and kind of excitedly make this announcement, it's going to lower people's confidence when you're talking to them about other things as an authority. And I think that was kind of my biggest worry out over this whole thing. Again, this isn't a knock on Sean. This isn't necessarily meant to be a knock on Dr. Evans, but I just wish there was a little more, I guess this is my personal feedback, that there was like a little more caution with some of this stuff, because it's like, you're an authority. You don't want to have these unnecessary things, these sensationalistic claims, and maybe you're like, well, this isn't really that important. But when you do talk about things that are more like core to people's faith, and you've made this claim, they're going to kind of look at you and be like, well, like I won't call
yeah,
the scholar's name, but there's a guy who was like, well, we found this fragment of Mark, this very famous thing that happened about 10 years ago. I know what I'm referring
yeah,
to. And
yeah,
now every time I hear that scholar start talking, I think like, yeah, but you made this kind of big gaffe, and I understand. I'll put that aside, and I'll listen to your argument, what you have to say, and evaluate it based on the available evidence and how good your argument it is. But it's still in other people's minds, they're just going to tune you out because you're the credulous guy who jumped on a bandwagon of some artifact that wasn't even real and got too excited about it, announced it, and now you're in this weird situation. Does that make sense?
totally. No,
Yeah.
that makes perfect sense. It's when you commit yourself heavily to an idea, you uh you risk your credibility, right? And
Yeah.
that's come back to it's backfired for a bunch of these guys. And I think that in my personal opinion, I think that's what's behind this interview that Evans did. Like, I think this is like damage control. Um, these evangelical institutions were embarrassed
Hmm.
by being duped and by spending a lot of money. I know, like Southwestern, um, people got in big trouble for spending exorbitant amounts of money on, putting together this collection, and they had started, you know, a much larger project of like a permanent um a permanent facility, right, for housing them and analyzing them, which is not cheap. And this at a time when the seminary was experiencing other sorts of budgetary issues. If I remember correctly, they had to scale back dramatically, like their counseling department or something like that. And one of the reasons for this is because so much money was being funneled into this other thing, right?
Yeah.
So, like, the implications of this can be much broader than what people at the outset realize.
Yeah.
So,
And not to harp on this too much, but it's like we already have a lot of good stuff. And my
yep.
channel is about like, let's talk about the text, because you, Kip, and I will look at the text and have all kinds of disagreements. But we agree that we have the text. I mean, you talk about variants. I know you have a course and different things like that. That's through Myth Vision. I might, we can discuss that at the end there or whatever. But like the text is at least fairly well established here, and we're looking at different things and how we interpret it. But when
Mhm.
you're looking at this from a scientific perspective over these few fragments that these like kind of relic hunters are spending big dollars for. There's nothing for us to really argue about here, other than like we both agree that like this just seems a bit odd, you know, and
Yeah.
and there's just some weird stuff going on here.
And there's very little, like, if these fragments were authentic from a text critical perspective or like a religious historical perspective, there's very little to be gained. Most of them just look like, texts that we already knew
Hmm.
of the Hebrew Bible or the Septuagint, right? I mean, I highlighted a couple of those fairly sensational differences, but by and large, they're they as I've said elsewhere, they don't really have much text critical value. Like it's
Yeah.
just they literally do almost nothing to expand our knowledge of the text beyond what we already have. So, yep.
Yeah. So, and like you said, these universities are investing big money, and I'm just thinking like, man, invest that money in something else to
Yeah.
enhance either, like, if you want to argue for the credibility of the text, well, like, let's just invest that money in students, you know. Or, you know, you might think people come to different conclusions out of that, and that's totally fine, but yeah, it's strange. So do you want to continue with the video? Is there more that you want to cover there, or?
Yeah. Yeah, we can. Maybe before we do, I did notice
Sure.
there was something in the chat here uh mentioned a couple times, and I should probably say something about this.
Yeah,
So
I'll
I
try and find.
mentioned already that like this book, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Museum of the Bible. Yeah, there we go. Do we cover his excuse for having to retract his paper due to the documents he worked on being forgeries? Happy to go back if I missed it. So there's a history to this. People seem to think, I've seen this mentioned a few times on YouTube. People seem to think that I published this book because I'm one of the editors of this book. They seem to think that I published this book and then somebody else came along and revealed that all the fragments at the Museum of the Bible were forgeries, and that this was news to me, and it got retracted as a result. That's not what happened. So I was added to the Museum of the Bible project in 2014. At this point, I was already working on the stuff in Scoian's collection. And I and a couple of my colleagues were already putting together we're already accumulating data about the authenticity of these fragments. And people have to understand, like, this is not something that you can just do overnight. It takes a long time to work through the process of authentication and to get it right. Also, I was not the lead editor on that Museum of the Bible project, and from the start, I was kind of when I was looking at fragments that were given to me to review, um, I was flagging all this stuff that looked very, very suspicious to me. At the time, I'm not sure if people are aware of this, but when scholars were going to work on stuff belonging to the Museum of the Bible, at the time they were making us sign non-disclosure agreements. So it's not something that I could talk openly about. I had literally, one other conversation partner that I could review this stuff with, and in our internal discussions, I'm raising major issues that I have with the fragments and saying, I'm just not even certain these are authentic. They look like forgeries to me. And the response I was continuing to get was, okay, this is, I see what you're saying, but this is something that we're not going to be able to deal with until after we're ready to publish the book. So when all the galley proofs for the book was done, I was asked to write a chapter for it, all about the physical features and the paleography. So I where is it here? I wrote this chapter here. As soon as I can find it. There it is. This one here. Oh, no, I was on the right screen. This is, paleographical and physical features of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Museum of the Bible Collection, a synopsis. And in this chapter, published in this book, I openly talk about the fact that I think there are several seriously problematic issues with these fragments, which could indicate that they are in fact forgeries. But people have to understand that I didn't have any control over, the publication of the book itself. I could only control my own contribution to it. I made recommendations to the other editors, but they were under no obligation to implement all of my suggestions and my corrections. So I get a little annoyed when people implicate me as, part of the problem, when from the start, all of my work on this has been about trying to get the data right and trying to ensure that the products are clean. Even with the publication of the Scoia'tael fragments, I was part of a minority voice on that team, insisting that we just come right out and say, I think there's huge numbers of these fragments that are forgeries. But Scoia'tael is a private collector. He's got an enormous stake in this. He was extremely reticent to just let us come out and say that, right? Sorry, could you put the
this was from Ben, and so I think he's standing up for you here and saying that from the beginning of the essay you claim that the authenticity cannot be established by any verifiable evidence. Their provenance remains a mystery, and so it's not like you so
no.
I think
so I hope that
I think it does.
I hope that addresses it.
Yeah, and I don't think that particular thing is like enough to just be like, okay, well, shut down Dr. Kipp. Don't listen to him anymore. Like, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Like, there's lots of reasons, and I don't know. It just seems. Well, I'll just leave it at that.
Sure.
So far this has been like really fascinating stuff. We can continue through the stream unless you feel like, or not the stream, but the video with Evans. Sure. Unless you feel like, okay, we'll go ahead.
How much time do you have left here?
I could probably go another 20 to 30 minutes. So
okay.
Yeah.
So let's watch a bit more of the video.
Okay.
Foundation
and this problem.
Okay.
Board. I'm a board member of the Dead Sea Scrolls Foundation, and the chairman of the board is Weston Fields. He's been operating this thing for 30 years. Its basic function is to raise money for Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship.
Okay.
To get the DJD volumes, Discoveries of Judean Desert, get them published, get them out there, get all the scrolls published. Well, he knows the Kando family. That's how we refer to it. That's not really the last name, but Kando was his nickname. The guy who was buying fragments from the Shep, the Bedouin and Mark Samuel back in the day. Palestinian Christian man, way back. I met him in 1992. He died the following year in 93. So he's the guy. He knew, like Bill Brownlee, my doctoral supervisor, Bill Brownlee, John Trevor, they were there in Israel 47, 48 when the discoveries from the first cave came to light. So anyway, I'm discussing this. This was the number one business item at our meeting at the Society of Biblical Literature meeting just last November in Denver. And I said, let's get updated on these fragments. And he said, they're all right. These are authentic. They came from Kando's box of fragments that he keeps in Switzerland. There's no question they're authentic. And I said, yeah, but Weston, what about this evidence of the ink jumping the cracks, right? Going over pieces of dirt stuck on the leather and so on. And he told me, he said, all of the scrolls are that way.
Really?
I just, what? He says, yeah, my student. And the guy's working. He said they should have looked at the unquestionably authentic scrolls. The ones that were originally found that everybody knew about, not the ones that mysteriously showed up decades later in somebody's saddlebags from his camel. They all have that.
Hold on a second. I need a couple things here. So, as I mentioned already, people have been looking at the authentic Dead Sea Scrolls under microscopes for years. I and my colleagues during this time were regularly at the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem looking at authentic Dead Sea Scrolls fragments under microscope, have taken hundreds of pictures of them under microscope. And in the video response that I did to Evans, which is on my channel, I actually show maybe, a half a dozen or a dozen photographs that that we have taken of authentic Dead Sea Scrolls fragments in an effort to show just how different they do look from the forgeries. So there's that.
Yeah.
The things and the things that Weston Fields has suggested, where all the authentic Dead Sea Scrolls perform, like the ink on the fragment performs exactly the same way as on these forgeries, is not entirely accurate. As I pointed out, there's a variety of reasons beyond just this interaction, which have suggested to us that they're forgeries. And then finally, it's very interesting that Craig Evans makes this comment about, fragments that arrived out of someone's saddlebags from his camel, in a way that sounds to me like he's kind of trying to denigrate the source of these things, which I thought was pretty gross. And one of the reasons for that is because people need to be aware that this is how, like, 98% of all the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. This is how they all got to the Israel Antiquities Authority, was out of saddlebags on a Bedouin's camel. They're the ones who found them, and they're the ones who brought them to the archaeologists.
Interesting. Yeah, that's we'll keep going here.
And so he says, there's no doubt in my mind, this is Weston Fields, he doesn't mind me quoting him, he's writing a history of the whole discovery of the scrolls and their publication. Volume 1's out, volumes 2 and 3 are in the press. And he says all of the scrolls are that way. And here is, Sean, this is the interesting thing. We've always wondered why expensive leather scrolls instead of cheaper papyrus. And of course, we're talking about a library that at one time would have had way more than 1,000 books. We have about 900 fragments of 990 or whatever now. One cave completely washed out, so all of its contents ended up in Dead Sea molecules today, if you could find them. So we're talking about a library that probably had 1,200, 1,300, 1,400 writings at one time. And the vast majority of them, with very few exceptions, were written on leather. Why? And one of the theories is purity concerns. One of the concerns is that, well, Jewish cows, Jewish leather, handled properly, can be used for these sacred writings, copies of scripture and so on. Papyrus, imported from Egypt, no telling whose hands handled the papyrus, we don't want. So even though the leather is harder to make, harder to prepare, more expensive, and so that's one of the theories. By the way, the majority of these leather scrolls are from an extinct cow, an extinct bovine species. Some of them are made from goat. Some of them are made from the native ibex. But most of them, and I've seen the reports. There was a conference at Princeton in 1997, and we had all the DNA reports given to us at that time. These studies of the leather was so specialized and so sensitive. Human skin oil from the scribes handling the scrolls. We picked up the human DNA off the leather scroll. Yeah,
that's just nonsense, eh? Like, you can't distinguish if you can detect human DNA on these parchments, it's impossible to so precisely distinguish it as to well, that belonged to the scribe. So no, there is no human, there's no reports of human DNA on the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments anywhere. This is stuff that I don't know if Craig was just pulling us out of off the top of his head. I kind of suspect this is something he got from talking to Weston Fields. Remember, this is the guy who talked about extracting the DNA of Jesus, from Great Isaiah scroll, right? So I think that's probably where this comes from. Also, it's important to recognize that while most of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the authentic Dead Sea Scrolls, are written on parchment, lots of them are also written on papyrus, and lots of what we would recognize as biblical texts are written on papyrus. There's all sorts of, I have friends, this is not my thing, but I have friends and colleagues who do work on matters of ritual purity in early Judaism at the time of Jesus, at Qumran. And it's not nearly as cut and dried or as simple as Evans suggests it to be. We really don't have a clear idea of the purity concerns insofar as they extended to the writing of this material. So I think this whole question of animal skin versus papyrus is there's not any good evidence to support this idea. It's kind of it's kind of silly, I think.
I mean, it seems like that's part of why he's interested in this, is because, okay, well, this is part of the purity concerns, and so this is where me, biblical scholar, shows an interest. But to me, it's like a bit on the flimsy side, like you said, and I don't know. Again, it's also kind of like, okay, big whoop-de-doo. But
yeah.
All right, we'll continue here.
Sure.
Well, here's now the new theory. This is brand new. The stuff I've told you up to now, a few people know. Now, everybody's going to hear this. We think that's why they use the leather as a purity issue. We suspect all of these scrolls, when the leather was made, the leather was stored for a period of time. Quarantine, not used too soon. And this is why the leather, and of course, this is super dry, don't forget. This is the Dead Sea. You've been to Dead Sea, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I've been there in the summertime. I was there in July. And I tell you, you were just drinking water, and you never needed to use the restroom. Just keep drinking water. It's going out of you.
Right.
And that would dry out that leather so fast. And so if this leather was quarantined, some kind of ritual, some kind of purity thing, before you could write sacred text on it, all of the leather would have an aged, cracked appearance. And because it's been handled and put in places and moved around, some of it would have dust or whatever embedded in it. And so all of these clues that my former student and others picked up on, legitimate, good observation using the microscope, that explains them. And so what we could be looking at without ever thinking about it before, that's why we need to look at all the scrolls under a microscope and ask ourselves, hey, is this some kind of purity thing? Because Sean, ceramic cookware has to be broken because it becomes impure after coming in contact with certain types of oils and so on. Stone jars don't, which is why you have John 2, the 6 big stone jars for the purification custom of the Jews. Jesus turns the water into wine. So that's why you have a lot of chalk, you have a lot of stone, and so on, because it doesn't become impure. Ceramic, oh my gosh, you got to break it. That's why anytime you find a Jewish village, you find tons and tons of broken ceramic. There are steps taken for leather as well.
Okay.
And this cohere with the leather being a certain age before anybody writes on it. And if it's in the Dead Sea region, which is super dry, this explains why the leather has a dried out, cracked appearance before the ink is applied. And so this whole controversy could be leading to a breakthrough about purification, understanding of the very leather on which they wrote, which is why they do choose leather, as we had surmised originally, and not papyrus imported from Egypt. So we could be stumbling into a whole new area of inquiry that nobody had ever thought about, thanks to this controversy over whether or not these fragments are fake. They aren't fake, they're genuine. So there you go.
Okay.
Isn't it an interesting world?
Yeah, that's probably a good place to stop it then. And there's a bunch of things here. Maybe I'll just share my screen once more, because I was thinking there's like another fragment that I wanted to show here, and that's this one here. Let's pull this up. So there's a couple of interesting things on this fragment here. So as I'm just pulling this up, I'll talk a little bit about what Evans is basically saying is that the reason these fragments look so badly dried out is because they were stored for a long time before anybody ever thought to use them as like a quarantine process, as a way of ensuring that they were free of contamination or something before anybody ever wrote on them. I'm just trying to bring up the fragment in question here. So you can see I'm highlighting here some of the ways in which the letters the ink bleeds off of them. And this is caused by the condition of the leather. So this one here in particular, this is a large fragment from the Museum of the Bible. It's from the book of Malachi. And like you can, on several of the letters, if you can see the way the ink's kind of slipping in all sorts of different directions. It kind of like a spider web spindles off of, and that's caused from just the sheer dryness of the leather itself. So this is the sort of thing that you don't see in the authentic Dead Sea Scrolls. And one of the things, like one of the reasons, I just want to pull this fragment up again here, just to show something else, which I forgot to mention, which I think is quite telling. So this fragment here on the bottom, this is this Malachi fragment on the bottom right. You'll notice you can see clearly 2 lines of text. And then underneath that, it looks like a blank section before there's text again on the left-hand side. This is really problematic because there's actually supposed to be text here, and it's very strange that we don't see any text here. Because it's not like a paragraph break or anything. This just interrupts like the middle of a sentence, right?
Yeah.
And the editors of this particular fragments were like, well, I guess it's down here where it's disappeared or been damaged or what have you. And I think this is again one of these clear signs that somebody's making mistakes while they're writing a forgery. So but I just wanted to show that one of the big problems with this theory that Evans is proposing is that this would then have to mean that the fragments that are just in the private collections that all show these signs of having been badly worn out before anybody ever wrote on them are somehow distinct from all the rest of these fragments, which look like they were written on long before, like before they were ever dried out like that. So it's a situation where I think this is a very poorly it's not a very well thought out theory. And I don't think the evidence supports this because, as I mentioned, we have literally hundreds and hundreds of fragments that don't look like this, where they look normal, like they should. So, and I think too, this is I think you were right earlier, where this is where Evans has taken such a keen interest in this. Like he's big on this idea of ritual purity and what this means theologically. So
yeah. I mean, I get trying to get a better understanding of like the background of the people and all that other stuff, but it seems like you're already kind of you're laying a theory on top of something that's already janky to begin with, and it's not a good foundation to be building a hypothesis on at all. Like that's how biblical scholars get into like some craziness in a real big hurry here. So yeah, I don't know. This whole thing is fascinating to me because again, you just have this like this real insider perspective where you've worked on these things yourself, and I don't know. Again, I just find this thing to be so weird, and so. If we could maybe like put a bow on it, like what are some of your takeaways on all of this? Is there anything like that you want people to know or even Dr. Evans to know? Yeah. So
sure. So I guess I think the most important takeaway, in particular for your audience, um, is the recognition of what the Dead Sea Scrolls are and what they are not. I think is important. I mean, they're an enormously important text critical tool. They provide the very earliest evidence that we have for the text of the Hebrew Bible in and around the time of Jesus, prior to the destruction of Herod's temple. And they provide extremely useful, valuable information of this world in which Jesus lived, right?
Mm.
The world of Roman Palestine, of early Judaism. And I think there is a temptation to leap forward from this and to draw conclusions that are not necessarily supported by the evidence. I'm doing a series on my channel right now all about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and one of the things I point out I think it's in like the first video, is how people have leaped to apologetic conclusions about the Dead Sea Scrolls, perhaps prematurely.
Mhm.
Yes, on the one hand, they provide extremely good, evidence about the shape of the Bible at the time of Jesus. And yes, we have huge numbers of texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls which confirm the Masoretic text of the Bible.
Okay.
But that's only part of the picture. Like, there's all sorts of other texts at the Dead Sea Scrolls which, show that the text was not as cleanly established as people would like it to be. The picture of the biblical text at the time of Jesus is kind of messy. It's not really precise. There seems to have been quite a bit of toleration for different kinds of versions and editions, and then even deciding what, like, even this idea of the last video I made is titled "What is a Biblical Text Anyways?" And it's kind of exploring this idea that we call things Bible on the basis of how this text has arrived to us. It's in our Bibles are based on these manuscripts, um, but from, like, just looking at what's there in the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, it's not like anything's labeled, right?
Right.
It's not like they said, well, this is a biblical text and this isn't. So these are decisions that people are making after the fact, saying, well, drawing this distinction between them, I have a tendency to think that it's not as clean, it's not as clear. The whole picture of early Judaism at this time is a lot more complex. And it is super interesting though, too, right?
Mhm.
Like and there's still huge amounts to be learned from what's there.
Awesome. And you have a course you're doing with Derek on Myth Vision, is
Yeah,
that
man.
right? Okay. So you're gonna destroy my audience's faith by no, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. Um,
I
no,
hope
I think
not.
it's
Well,
no, I'm kidding. I think it's important for us to listen to people who are on different sides of these things, so that we can learn to make
Yep.
better claims, more modest claims, not oversell the evidence. Because I think a lot of apologists, I agree with you, definitely do oversell
yeah.
the evidence of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so, where can they find that at?
So this course, the name of the course is it's very provocative. It's Real Israelite Religions,
You
facts
are
and
going to
found,
destroy my people's faith. No,
and
I'm
propaganda
totally,
of the Bible. No, hey,
I'm
but
kidding. I'm
I
kidding. I'm
listen.
kidding. I'm
I
kidding.
have to say that this is a course that I taught in
Hmm,
a Christian university
there you go.
years ago. I've pulled out the because it was part of the course when I first taught it was like it was Israelite religion and Old Testament theology.
Hmm.
So I've stripped out the Old Testament theology component of it, just to make it more of it's basically an exploration of the texts,
Hmm.
and the material culture, the archaeology, in an effort to see what the religious world of the ancient Israelites looked like. And it's a historical social exploration of the development of this religion, basically from like the early Iron Age up through to Second Temple Judaism. And I think it's a lot. There's lots of fun parts of it. I think like the last lecture in my course is called Zombies in America and at Qumran. And it's an exploration of the whole concept of apocalypticism, but against the backdrop of what at the time was like my favorite television show, AMC's The Walking Dead. So I think it's super fun. But yeah, if you if you have the intestinal spiritual fortitude, then then
Dr.
sign
Kills.
up.
Dr. Kill's going for the kill. No, I listen to. I mean, I take courses when I can. Sometimes there's free ones like on YouTube and different things where,
Yeah.
I mean, you're not going to get as much in depth as you like, but I like listening to some of the courses that have been done on Yale and that used to be on iTunes U back in the day, historical Jesus and different things like that. If anything, it just raised lots of questions for me to just go and inquire and study, and it didn't really, none of it really shook me. It just kind of made me
It shouldn't.
interested in looking more into it, and where do I agree with some of these scholars? Where do I think some of the problems are? But I think these backgrounds, these things that we can learn are interesting, and it's important to listen to what the other side says. So I don't have a ton of questions, but I do got one I think would be a good one for you to answer. This is again from Ben. What does Dr. Davis recommend for those who want to read the scrolls in English? He's got
Yeah.
Vermes.
So Geza Vermatius translation is kind of like the standard, and it is very good. I think it's fine. The other one that he's mentioned here is I don't actually have a copy of Vermesh's translation, but this one here is this is Ibert Tichler and Garcia Martinez, Florentina Garcia Martinez's Dead Sea Scrolls Study Edition. This is quite, there's a cheaper paperback version of this one that is really good. But the nice thing about this translation is that it's a oh, there you go, you can see it. So it's like a Hebrew English. Would you call that that's not what, I don't think that's called an interlinear. It's just you got the Hebrew on one side and you got the English on the other side. So this one is very good, and this is probably your I would say the most minimalist translation. And what I mean by that is like when you encounter the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll see right away that because they're fragmentary, there's lots of stuff that's missing, right? We have fragments with text on them, and then lots of stuff that's absent. Scholars have tried to reconstruct things that are missing, and some of them get really, really carried away.
Yeah.
And these guys are probably the best at just showing you what's there. They keep their reconstructions to a minimum, and all the reconstructions I think are just really, really sensible if they suggest them at all. The third one is a book by Michael Wise, Ed Cook, and Martin G. Abegg. Marty Abegg is he's a friend of mine. He was a former mentor of mine at Trinity Western. And they've written a very nice English translation of the so-called non-biblical Dead Sea Scrolls. That's this one as well. I think actually Geza Vermeesh and all of these English translations are the so-called non-biblical scrolls, things that aren't in the Bible. That one is as far as I'm aware, the most comprehensive. So it's the most material. Um, and I think it's pretty good too. There's lots of excellent background and introductory material to the scrolls there. And then there's one more called the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, which is by Peter Flint, Eugene Ulrich, and Marty Abegg. And that is, as far as I'm aware, the only English translation of biblical manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's a really useful one to have. Of course, one of the things people need to be aware with that translation is that in several instances we have multiple copies of so-called biblical texts, like just of the book of Isaiah. There's 22 copies of text from Isaiah, right? So they have to make editorial decisions in terms of what they're going to include and what readings they're going to go with in that one. But that's all of them. I think they're all really good. There's none I would say don't buy that one. It's terrible. So
Okay.
no.
Oh, it's awesome.
No.
Thanks for the
You bet.
question there. And thanks for the answer. And one more, and then we'll wrap it up here. How long does it take to read everything found in the
Everything
Quran
right.
cover to cover?
So if you're reading the non-biblical stuff, like I think Marty's Mike's and Ed's English translation is like this big. It's almost 600 pages, I think. There's a lot of material. Just to give you an idea, we're talking about literally tens of thousands of fragments. Estimates are about 1,000 individual manuscripts. And again, some of these are multiple copies of the same thing, but it is a lot of material. And just to read it all the way through from beginning to end, it's not easy because lots of it is it's ancient literature, and a bunch of them are ancient calendars, which are difficult to read at the best of times. So it's in terms of time, I don't know. I guess it probably take the same amount of time as it would for you to read your Bible.
Gotcha. Awesome. All right. Thanks for the question, Graves. And so, well, Dr. Kipp, again, I really appreciate you joining the show. I think this has been really fascinating, kind of the whole world of Dead Sea scholarship and some of these forgeries, or how you determine what's a forgery, what's not. I think it's been really helpful. And I think hopefully the biggest takeaway that people got is like what's really important. You and I we could disagree all day about the interpretations of the text. Maybe someday we could have that conversation. But some of this stuff, again, it's just kind of a weird thing to get too excited about and then make a big deal about. And I worry again about the credibility when you throw your name behind these claims, what it can do to that credibility. And so, and I think it's important.
Will say, if I can, I'm going to say one more thing about that. So I mentioned this before, and if this is something people are interested in, so the public lecture that I gave at the University of Helsinki, I will be uploading to my channel at some point in the next couple of weeks or so. The name of the talk is "These Things Are Written That You May Believe: Sellers, Scholars, Apologists, and the Fake Dead Sea Scrolls." And it's basically this talk that I gave is basically an exploration of this question: who was buying Dead Sea Scrolls and why? I think it's quite revealing. It's quite it's quite revealing about the way in which just the story, even just from the beginning of the first discoveries. Wow, my face got totally washed out there, didn't it?
I was like, did you open the blinds or something?
No, it's the light from the
go.
monitor in the background, right? But so it's interesting to track just the narratives that people construct around these manuscripts and these artifacts, and I'm not just talking about from religious perspectives. In a very interesting way, the Dead Sea Scrolls have had a major role to play in just the formation of the state of Israel. And so that's yeah. In my talk, I kind of go through the development of these narratives in their
Yeah.
discovery.
Yeah, well, definitely. Again, it's just search Kipp Davis or Dr. Kipp Davis. The channel comes right up. Underrated channel as far as the skeptical
Thanks,
side
man.
goes. I mean, there's like a few channels that I watch because I'm interested in text. So Apology is talking about the resurrection or the Bible. He's got a scholar on like Allison or Ehrman or somebody I'm interested. Myth Visions. He's got so many different people. I can't always keep up with all of it. But there's lots of good information there. I don't really care as much about the philosophical stuff that people argue back and forth about. But yeah, definitely check it out. Yeah, but it's worth checking out because he does point out where apologists do oversell the data on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we definitely don't want to be guilty of that. We want to make modest claims and then take that, compare it with other scholarship and study and learn. And this is what this should be all about. And that's what I don't like a lot about this whole online counter apologetics and apologetics is like, we could just enjoy nerdy stuff together. And even if we come down on different sides of it, having conversations like this, I think just can be helpful and informative. And we ought to be looking to build what bridges we can, not just be like, you know what, I'm going to make this video and I'm going to just dunk on this dude. That whole thing gets kind of tired. And I've been guilty of it. I think all of us have been guilty of it at one time or another,
Yep.
but it's good to just, have fun talking about these things. And so
Totally agree.
thank you guys so much for joining this stream. And
you should maybe, Captain Deadpool gave you some love there.
Hey, all right. Thank you, Dadpool, for the super chat. I appreciate that. Good call out there, Kip. And then thank you, Nitty
too.
for the super chat. I really appreciate that. And so yeah, definitely helps keep these kind of conversations going. So, all right, y'all. Thanks so much for watching.
Thank you, everyone.
Yep.
Thanks, Eric. This was fun.
Yep, you bet. Take care, everyone.